So, Martin, you were the co-founder of the Men and Boys Coalition. You've been taking an interest in men's issues for a long time now. Let's look for a few seconds at positive discrimination. Now, I've always contended that positive discrimination in favour of women must inevitably be negative discrimination against men.
Yeah.
Have you got any direct experience of this?
I mean, it's so manifest, it's difficult to know where to start. Let's start with education. So one of the big things I made my pioneering work in was the working class boys in Britain, especially the white working class boys, have been the bottom of education for 20 straight years. And that's from kindergarten to university, all the way through, irrespective of background, social class, poverty, single parents, you name it. Boys always fare worse and white boys fare the very worst. And yet, when we raised this with the charity, the Men and Boys Coalition, I wrote articles for the Times, the Sunday Times, the Telegraph, the Daily Mail. I was on ITV This Morning. I was on Sky News for years. I went to committee room meetings. I sat down with David Lammy. I sat down with numerous Conservatives. You put the data in front of them. They just weren't interested. They said, well, if we push back against this, we're expecting problems. And I was like, what are you talking about? The evidence is...
You've already got problems.
Yeah, the problem is there. And the data is here. Look, here it is. And more than that, we went around the world finding best practice in places like Sweden, in places like the Bronx in Sweden, that had a very proactive kind of attitude towards paternity leave for men. So there was some form of equity. So in the UK, you get 2 weeks off if you're a dad, on statutory minimum £122 a week. In Sweden, you get 80% full pay. It's like furlough for dads. And as a consequence, more men took an active role in parenthood. And so women were allowed to go back to work. It helped women. When we brought this evidence back to the UK, MPs like Jess Phillips and the usual suspects said, well, we don't want that. It's sexist. And you're like, and you started to realise that institutionally and politically there was resistance everywhere to giving equality to men.
Let's move on from education for a moment towards where most people think of positive discrimination happening, which is in employment, and indeed in politics for that matter, or women shortlists, which is an initiative of the Labour Party. And indeed the Conservative Party for a long time had a policy that you had to have an equal number of men and women on the shortlist, regardless of merit, and those are the crucial words, regardless of merit.
Yes.
Let's look at employment for a moment, quotas. You know, you must have X number of women on a board, you must have X number of women here and there. But for the man, that means that he begins at a disadvantage. Now, how does trying to eliminate one disadvantage by causing another disadvantage get us anywhere?
Well, it doesn't. It's more of the bad. It's the same old story. I remember I was talking about shared parenthood and fathers having more access to paternity leave, and I was invited into like all the big corporate banks. I was a token bloke. I was in rooms full of the most powerful feminist women on the FTSE companies in Britain being told that men had privilege and advantage, and I was like, well, where are all the men? There aren't any men here.
Did you actually ask that?
I did.
And what was the answer?
They said, well, they run the FTSE 100. There are more men called John than women that run FTSE 100 companies. I was like, yeah, because what happens when you look at the data, and I got some data from HSBC Bank, they said globally, what happened was when people became parents, mothers typically worked less, and they were well paid to work less. So there were rich schemes to enable them to stay at home and be mothers, and the dads worked more hours, irrespective of cultural background, from India, Hong Kong, Asia, Australasia, UK, it was the same. And when I said to this room, hands up who went to a comprehensive like me, no hands went up. And they all went to better universities than me. My dad was a coal miner, but I was always told I have this thing called male privilege. And I said, well, when did that start? Because I don't remember that kicking in. And the trouble is, Anne, this idea that men are born privileged, especially white men, is so imbibed now, it's so endemic, that it's now become true. The patriarchy, the myth of the patriarchy. You know, my dad used to work 16 hours a day to support my mum. You know, she was a housewife and 2 kids. And that now has been reframed as oppression. It's just nonsense. It's everywhere. And when you sort of say to these people, I remember this one time, this one brought a book out called The Glass Wall, because the glass ceiling wasn't enough.
Yeah.
There were walls everywhere. There was a glass wall, and that is, you can't go sideways because the boys' network keeps all the power. I remember being in this glass atrium of an office, and outside there were some homeless men drinking lager. I went, there's a glass wall. Look at those guys there. What do you see? And they went, homeless people. I went, no, homeless men. 85% of the homeless are men. The conversation is about them. The conversation became entirely focused on the tiny proportion of men at the top that wield the power. And the kind of boys that I grew up with on the coal fields of Nottinghamshire were about as likely to become one of those men as they were to become an astronaut. And all of this just became taken as fact, that if you're born male, then you're born privileged, and it's nonsense.
But a lot of women would then say to you, yes, all right, but you're making a broad social comment, because women growing up in those sorts of disadvantaged households, are not going to end up running a footsie company any more than the man brought up in a disadvantaged household is going to be an astronaut. So they would say that is a class observation. I'm looking at something very, very specific. I'm looking at saying, because there have been historically too few women, we are now going to institute a procedure whereby women are given special advantages. Now, I'm a 70s feminist, not a 90s feminist. I'm a 70s feminist. And I continually amaze the next generation down when I say to them, when I graduated, it was perfectly lawful, utterly lawful, to have an advertisement for a job with two rates of pay underneath, one for men, one for women. Was lawful.
And that's wrong.
But it was lawful. This is the point I'm making. Now, the 70s feminists said we want a level playing field. We want total equality, and we will compete with the men, but we want to compete on the same basis. We don't want to start with these disadvantages. By the 90s, that had become, oh dear, we haven't made it on an equal playing field. We now want that playing field tilted towards us, and we want all women shortlists. We want quotas. Now, the instant you say you want an all-women shortlist, what you are saying in terms almost is a man cannot have this seat in Parliament, on the board, on whatever it may be. It's reserved. A man cannot have it, no matter how good he is, no matter how able he is, no matter how experienced he is, even if he's grown up in that constituency, brought his own children up in that constituency, doesn't matter. Now, imagine if it was the reverse.
It would be.
Imagine if it was the reverse.
So what basically happened is that a perception of historical inequality became a new inequality. I was meeting HR directors of really big companies who, after the presentations, we'd have a little glass of wine. They say to me, I deal with so many men, middle-aged men now, who come and see me all the time, who tell me I can't get promoted. I've just hit this dead end. And they were being passed by at every opportunity by a female, an LGBT, a minority. And, these conversations weren't being had in the mainstream media because, you're racist and you're sexist. But it's happening. I'm contacted all the time by men who just can't get on because they just don't fit the current trend. And all women shortlists are, I think, incredibly discriminatory. The BBC itself now won't hire men, it hires minorities. They specifically advertise for BAME candidates only as trainee journalists. Sky News now in London will not hire white people. It's part of their employment policy, and the same with men. It's a terrible time to be a man, and that sounds like we're going to cry me a river. Every day is International Men's Day. But my point is that you don't address something that was wrong by reintroducing something that's also wrong. It's the same prejudice in different trousers. And that's the problem, I think, where we get this huge resistance from men. They always used to say to me in these rooms, where are all the men? I said, well, if you perhaps stopped talking about men as oppressors, as men as the source of the problem, and less stick and more carrots, you might get them into the room. But at the moment, you're treating them as toxic, oppressive, repulsive, and guess what? They don't want to hear it. And so we have this gender war, and there's no real way of men getting involved without being oppressive, and that's terrible.
My contention has always been, you compete on merit. You don't compete on anything else. You compete on merit. And if 100% of a board is male or 100% of a board is female, but they've all got there on merit, it doesn't actually matter. The composition, the quotas, it doesn't matter. And yet we have arrived at a situation where merit is discarded in favour of image. That's the only way you can put it. Now, we need that to be reversed, not to go back to the old ways, but simply to go back to where we were in the 70s when we said, right, everybody equal, now get on with it.
Yeah, and the funny thing is about this, when you look at the most progressive countries around the world, let's look to Scandinavia. So Finland is a shining beacon of equality. They spent millions and millions, if not billions of euros advancing equality. So they put money into STEM, science and all that for women, and they encourage men to be teachers. They try to reverse, generations of career choices. And actually what happened was the opposite of what they intended. And that is when you gave people more support in the form of state benefits if anything went wrong, and when you gave them free access to education, free childcare to support their career choices, it actually polarised the genders towards where they just were already. Yeah. In fact, even more so. There were more male engineers and there were more female nurses and teachers, because guess what? If you allow people freedom of choice, they tend to go where they want to go.
Yeah.
Caring professions, the more kind of mathematical, process-driven career choices. And so you can spend an eternal amount of money trying to reverse this. Maybe that's just what people want to do.
Well, it's there from childhood. I mean, you put children with toys. The boys tend to, it's not exclusive, but the boys tend to go for the trains and the girls tend to go for the dolls. Now, there are exceptions. And so my view would be that as long as a woman can become an engineer and isn't discriminated against because she's a woman and can just as easily as a man become an engineer, then it doesn't actually matter how many do.
No, and that brings me back to an earlier point of, not only are there no barriers to women becoming engineers in the UK or men becoming teachers or whatever.
Or nurses.
Nurses, yeah, but there are actually huge incentives. There are a huge number of scholarships for universities. There's a ton of government money being spent on STEM science for girls. There's loads and loads of initiatives to do that. And there is nothing really to help men as a counterpoint. And so men are kind of drifting along at the moment. They're a bit kind of listless. We've moved on from the gender war now because we've had COVID and now it's COP26. There's always a new culture war. But I think men have just kind of been left behind. And one of the tragic consequences of that, of course, has been this sort of suicide epidemic. Fatherlessness is a huge, huge issue. Yes. I did a huge amount of work into that. And when you look at the men in jails, 95% of jail inmates are men. And about 3/4 of those men tend to be coming from single parent families, ostensibly where they grew up without a father. And so the whole conversation was about toxic masculinity, being a man is poisonous. But I started to say in the Telegraph when I was a columnist there, well, what about if positive male role models were around? Here's the evidence. If there's a positive man in a child's life, they're much less likely to go to jail, to abuse drugs, to abuse alcohol, to have a criminal record, better educational outcomes. The evidence is there. And yet, the headwind of political discourse and media discourse is that men are bad. And it's incredibly damaging for men.
Well, why haven't men fought back? The women fought like tigers. I mean, you think of the suffragettes.
Yeah.
And then you come all the way through to the 70s, which I mentioned, when the women said, look, we want the law itself to step in and to guarantee equality. And the women really fought and fought and fought. And my thesis is that they won, and then they haven't known what to do ever since. But why aren't the men fighting?
One of my favourite dinner party questions is, when 8 million women got the vote back in the day, how many men also got the vote at the same time? And you normally get tumbleweed. The answer is 5 million.
Yeah.
5 million working class men also couldn't ever vote. And those men were the men who died in the trenches, in Ypres and the Somme.
Yeah, absolutely.
Working class men who didn't hold land weren't allowed to vote either. They've been airbrushed from history in this debate. And really, the suffragettes rightly take a lot of the plaudits for changing history and changing the law. But in actual fact, the horrors and the grotesque wastage of World War I was what really forced that debate along. And all those boys that were blown to pieces in the mud in France and were gassed to death, they've been airbrushed from history. And that is what I think is happening now. So you say, well, why aren't the men fighting back? There's a huge headwind against you. So for example, when we started the charity, we weren't embraced as allies of equality. We were seen as a competitor, because there's a huge amount of money.
Yes.
There's a huge amount of money goes into the Violence Against Women and Girls Initiative, the Women and Equalities Minister. Well, why call it the Women and Equalities Minister? How about just calling it the Equalities Minister?
Yeah.
How about having a Men's Minister? Now that would be a positive solution, but it would never be allowed, of course, because it would be seen as sexist. And so when we started charities, we started writing all the media, we started making documentaries, we started really getting the message out there. At first, we were embraced as, oh, wow, these people are progressive. But then quite quickly, it was like, well, they're going to take a share of the government pie. And so we were seen as a threat. And we were quite quickly either attacked or closed down, or if it was successful, co-opted. I'll give you an example. So the Campaign Against Living Miserably, which was the male suicide reduction charity. Amazing work. I've sat in Parliament with two of their CEOs driving down male suicide. And they were so successful, they were told they should be more inclusive. Because even though 75% of suicides are male, what about the other quarter? We'll give you some more money if you're more inclusive. And here we go. Because it was successful, it was made cross-gender. Well, there are manifest charities dealing with women's issues, but the small ones are starting from men. I'll give you an example. The Mankind Initiative, which deals with domestic violence against men. It's the only charity of its kind in the United Kingdom. Its annual budget for its call centre, £44,000 in Somerset. I went there and made a movie for Daily Politics Live, Andrew Neil, and that the annual budget, which is solely from donations, is the same as a press officer for Women's Aid, which is paid for by donations and the government. So you're really, it's pea shooters against tanks in as far as getting the message out there. And if you're successful, you're either crushed or co-opted.
Right, but I'm going to return to my question, because I'm going to say this wasn't easy for the women. I can remember in the 70s there was enormous resistance to equality for women, and all manner of cases were made for it not being so. And we carried on, nevertheless, we carried on. And what I do see is that men are more or less complicit in their own oppression, because they accept all the sexist stuff, they accept allegations. They're almost required to acknowledge that they have unconscious bias because they're white male privileged. And yet what they should be doing is saying rot and fighting it, not accepting it, not being complicit with it.
I agree with that, but you must remember that now there's this huge headwind of the media. So the media are so bought into the notion of white male privilege, and that's because of academia. So downstream, for all this time, these people are coming through an entire system where they believe in patriarchy, they believe in white male privilege, they believe in toxic masculinity as truth, as religion. It really is a religion. And to go against a religion is heresy. And people are shamed and excommunicated and tarred and feathered daily on social media, in their professional life. It's dangerous to put your head above the parapet and stick up for these things. Professionally and personally dangerous. As a consequence, we do have a generation of men that are quite meekly taking this. I do concur on that. I got so kind of in the barbed wire of this in the end, and this is pre-Brexit. All of these communities that were hurting the most, they're the ones that voted Brexit the hardest, because they've been left behind, they've been forgotten. Former heavy industrial areas, coal mining, shipbuilding, you name it, and they haven't been helped with any political initiatives, and it all blew into that. And so they found a voice through Brexit. Look at the male vote in Brexit, look at the working class vote, look at the white vote in Brexit. They found their voice through that. But I do agree, they don't have adequate representation politically or even in the media. And even when we did get something going with the charity, with the Men and Boys Coalition, it ended up imploding because of identity politics. Because you cannot specifically help the neediest demographic, white working class boys, without being called racist. And that's the world we're in. So you're against this kind of headwind of identity politics, media oppression, social shaming, fear of losing your job, and so most men just keep their heads down.
As I say, in the 70s when I was graduating, perfectly lawful for an employer to say, here's a job and here are 2 rates of pay. That's now unlawful. Employer has to offer the same pay for the same job. But we've now moved somewhat, haven't we? And we've got to a point where an employer is supposed to be offering the same pay for a different job.
Yeah, I mean, a sort of clear example of that is something like Wimbledon or women's football. And it's like, okay, so women play 3 sets, men play 5 sets, and just look at the actual demographics and the driving behind that. Look at the audience numbers. Audience numbers dictate advertising revenue. The facts and the figures are clear as day, and yet equity is demanded for doing less work. Well, give me full pay for 3 days' work. Who wouldn't take that now? And if you go to things like supermarket work, so you have front of shop, nice sort of customer facing, how you doing, beep, 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 as opposed to being out back and lugging sort of crates around and loading lorries up. It's much harder work. Anybody can apply for those jobs, but people tend to apply for the jobs that they prefer doing. But you can't demand equal pay for different jobs. It's ludicrous, but that's where we are.
Well, that is happening on quite a scale. And indeed, when one looks at things called the gender pay gap, I mean, a lot of it is because women tend to work part-time when they've got families, they take maternity leave, so they lose time at work. And whatever it may be, there are very, very good reasons why, if you're looking at averages, there's always going to be a gender pay gap.
Yeah, the gender pay gap is one of the biggest myths of our times. I mean, quite simply, if you look at all the variance across it, from hours worked, choice. Don't forget, quite often women, as we said earlier, they choose to work in more caring, sharing professions, which typically tend to pay less. Look at teaching, look at nursing, as opposed to look at computing, look at engineering, and these are choices that people make. And the hours you have to work to get to the top are incredibly demanding. I know that. I worked in magazines, I got to the very top. And when I became a father, it didn't work for me. 18 months after becoming a dad, I gave it all up because I didn't see my kid. That was my choice. But I wasn't supported financially. I worked for the world's biggest magazine corporation, IPC Media, Time Warner, and it was routine and normal for mothers to ask to go part-time after becoming a mother. And it had never been done before where a father asked to go part-time. My deputy editor asked to go part-time. Not only did they refuse him, but they laughed. This is the world's biggest magazine publisher. Well, we can't do that. He's deputy editor. If we make that position part-time, everybody will want to go part-time. I said, there are hundreds and hundreds of women that work in this company who have gone part-time, not a single man. And there was no
but they
precedent.
weren't all deputy editors, were they?
No, but the point being, there was clear favouritism for mothers, which I support. I support flexible working if that works for the individual, but in terms of the framework of that company, there wasn't a single case where a man had been allowed to do it. And when we asked, we were more or less laughed at.
Yeah, I don't think I'd be totally... I'm now going to take you on a little bit, Martin, because I don't think I would be totally in favour myself of finding that a general was absent all the time, even if, a few of the privates were. And when somebody is the deputy editor, male, female, or any one of the various varieties which we're now led to believe exist, they're deputy editor full-time.
Well, you could say that, but I mean, look at the Green Party. I mean, hardly a huge success.
I'd rather not, actually.
Yeah, but they have deputy joint leaders, right? They share the position. Now, you can say that's progressive nonsense, but it does work for them. I would argue that if you have a person who's amazing for 3 days of the week and somebody who can help the other 2 days of it, that's a good way of doing things. But, a lot of people wouldn't agree. You clearly don't.
No.
But the point I'm trying to make is that those kind of conversations with HR directors are much more likely to achieve a favourable outcome if you're a woman than if you're a man. And that's a fact.
I will buy into that, but I'm just saying, when you're talking about men's equality, which I do think now is an issue, I don't think you do the cause much good by taking a role that really does demand full time and saying, whether it's male or female, I don't care what it is, saying there should be a right to part-time work. Yeah. There should only be a right to part-time work if it suits the employer.
Yeah, well, yes and no.
He's got to run the company, he's got to make a profit, he's got to make decisions. And he wants people in particular places And some of those places are suitable for part-time work. Some of them absolutely are not. Some can be shared. It just varies tremendously. And I've always taken the view that you shouldn't create endless burdens on employers in the name of somebody else's convenience.
Yeah, and it is true that to get to the top of any industry is very, very difficult. It's very competitive, people are out to get you, and the hours are long, the commitment is long. That's the way it is. And here we have the kind of motherhood issue. Biology is a bitch, you could say. And it is what it is. Yeah. And so women tend to give birth, but also, as I said, back in the Swedish model...
They tend to give birth, they do give birth.
Yeah, yeah, well, these days, who knows? Anyone can have a cervix. But look, if you go to places like Finland, Sweden, where they give complete equity, what happened was really interesting. Back in the 70s, the Swedish realised that the feminist movement in Sweden didn't want full equality of access to childcare because it was still seen as, well, that's a women's thing, which I believe it is. I'm a traditionalist at heart.
So am I,
I'm a traditionalist at heart. But given the choice, more women wanted to stay at home with their kids. Great. What that meant was, like it or lump it, the men were just going to the top and working all those hours that God sent.
Absolutely.
And so that's the way it goes.
I don't have a problem with that.
I don't either. But you can spend billions and billions of euros or pounds or dollars or whatever trying to reverse that, and you can't.
Yeah. Hello. If you're enjoying the New Culture Forum channel and you believe in our mission, may I invite you to join our membership scheme at the link below or on our website, newcultureforum.org.uk. Our work is more important now than ever, and we have great plans ahead for the future, but we can't do it without your support. From as little as £3 per month, you can help ensure that we continue on our mission. As a member, you'll receive a range of benefits, including access to exclusive content, invitations to our private events, including here at our studios, free copies of our books, and much, much more, including, of course, our famous NCF mug. If you aren't able to become a member, then please help us by clicking this button and subscribing to our channel. It's completely free. Just remember to also click the bell icon so that you can get notifications when we post new videos. Thank you.